Welcome back to this special conversation with economist Gita Gopinath on the major themes for the global economy and the Indian economy in 2018. Well, Gita, to that question now, how do you see Indian growth? I mean, for the longest time we thought, well, not longest time, for a better part of the 2000s, we thought 8% was our birthright. We've gone a distance. Do you think 8% is, round the corner?
Oh, I would never say that 8% is around the corner. We seem to be, like you said, undershooting it for a while now. Yeah. I think 6.7% at this point
is the forecast for FY18.
That's right. So I think that in that range, kind of between 6.7 and a little over 7% is where I expect growth to be.
Okay.
The policies and reforms that have been undertaken are not it's not like fiscal spending where you kind of see an effect much more quicker. It's going to take a little longer. Things like ease of doing business, GST reforms, bankruptcy reform, all of that are kind of more slow-moving factors. And so, but the important thing to keep in mind is that this is in the right direction.
Okay.
And that's great.
Okay. What do you think the government should do in the budget? You referred to fiscal spending. Would you like to see more of it?
No, I would not like to see more of fiscal spending. I think that India has won a lot of points for being fiscally responsible, and you certainly don't want to squander that.
Okay.
Now, it's always an interesting argument that maybe growth is even higher in the future than it is now, and so we can spend more. I would be a little cautious about that because growth rates in India haven't hit the 8% target at this point. So I would not push for that. I think fiscal conservatism has been good.
Now to come to the theme of 2018 globally, and here it mingles with the domestic theme. How do you see commodity prices? If global growth is as optimistic as you sounded earlier,
right.
Where would crude go?
I think the projections are that crude will go up some more, but nowhere near where it was before it kind of crashed in 2014, because there are many other sources of supply. There are many other low-cost producers. Like the U.S. is now a big producer of oil. So I think and they're able to very quickly increase the supply. So in that sense, I think there's a very natural upper limit on where crude prices can go.
Okay. So if it goes towards 70, how do you look at Indian inflation itself, given the backdrop of even crude straddling $65? Do you think we have troughed out on inflation and we should now start worrying domestically?
It's for India, the pass-through of crude prices into inflation is very high. So the headline inflation numbers are always going to look worse. The RBI, of course, focuses on on core inflation, which excludes these prices, and so they should keep in mind that monetary policy works with lags, and so in that sense, they certainly don't want to make a policy change right now, and then if crude prices adjust in the future, they're kind of behind the curve. So it is an issue. It is an issue. Now, I know that the RBI also pays a lot of attention to inflation expectations, and their most recent discussions flag the fact that inflation expectations have gone up. It's kind of interesting because what we've seen is that people are things like fuel prices are very salient. Food prices, vegetable prices are very salient to people, and so that can feed into inflation expectations very quickly.
Okay.
But to the extent that the RBI doesn't have much control over those prices, it should maybe kind of take that with a grain of salt about how inflation expectations are responding at this time.
Okay. Well, actually, among the minutes of the meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee, there was a reference, I think by Viral Acharya, that the inflation number could be above the 4% mark, 4.5% mark,
right,
for a better part of 2018. If that were the case, should the MPC hike rates or shouldn't it?
I see an argument for not raising rates at this point, for sure. There is the band of the plus or minus 2 percentage points. And given that growth is still, it's not as if it's growing at 8% at this time, I certainly wouldn't make an argument for raising rates.
Okay. Well, let me come to the other issue that has actually stymied growth in India, and you, in passing, referred to the bankruptcy code. It has been the twin balance sheet issue. Now, do you think that we have seen the worst of that, and we will have one worry less in 2018, or is it a large part of that worry still left with us?
I think a large part of it is still left. They're certainly paying closer attention to it. The recapitalization of banks is a big step in that direction. The bankruptcy reforms are a big step in that direction. But none of this happens overnight. These are very slow-moving variables.
Okay.
And so I don't think the problem has gone away for sure.
Okay. Actually, speaking about the bankruptcy code, I don't know how much interest you take in that, but the recent ordinance amending that code said that promoters of defaulting companies, especially if the default is over 1 year vintage, they cannot buy back their own assets till they clear the dues. You think it was good to go that far?
So I can see the two arguments, that one in favor and one against. I mean, I like the idea of promoters / shareholders basically suffering or incurring a real cost for having made bad decisions. And so, in that sense, I favor this policy. Now, I mean, the opposite is, of course, is who's going to value these assets, and maybe it might get undervalued. But at this point, given the recapitalization of banks, I think it's good to send a strong signal that promoters are not going to be safe.
That's right. If it's taxpayer money, then totally. It becomes a moral hazard. Yeah. But should we continue to have so much of taxpayer money going into public sector banks? What would you suggest? I mean, the government has repeatedly said the recap money is coming with reforms.
Right.
What should the reform be?
No, I think the reforms have to be to prevent an occurrence of this build-up of non-performing assets in the future. I mean, that's just what it has to be, to prevent, solve the moral hazard problem where people feel like every time they make bad decisions, the government steps in. This doesn't have to be costly. For instance, I mean, in the U.S., a lot of the banks were bailed out too. It turned out to be a winning proposition. So if this is a one-off thing, it could be fine. But you certainly don't want to signal that, that every time you make these bad decisions, the government is going to step in. So reforms that prevent that from happening. And I know that there's been discussions of that in terms of bail-in clauses and et cetera, that have been discussed. There
is an argument that, we should move towards greater privatization. Is that an answer?
Well, the U.S. had a lot of private banks that failed, so that needed bailouts. So that unfortunately, banks are.
So that's not the answer. Privatizing public sector.
I think I like the idea of privatizing more of Indian banking. The fact that 70% of Indian banking is in the public hands seems excessive. But at the same time, I think what we've learned absolutely from the financial crisis is that without appropriate regulation, I mean, banks just are too big to fail. And so even if you're private, it's almost guaranteed you're going to get bailed out. So that doesn't solve that problem at all.
Okay. Well, let me come to the global situation again, United States in particular. How do you think this tax reform will play out? Do you think a lot of money moves out of other countries into the United States?
I don't think so. I mean, people make a big deal about the U.S. companies bringing money back in. It's not as if there is money sitting in some box somewhere outside the U.S. It's basically sitting with financial institutions. No, it's sitting with this cash that's being supposedly held outside. It's basically sitting in some financial institution in the U.S. The only thing that's not being used is actually for investment, because that's when they get taxed. Right? So it's not as if we're going to see a big move back. I mean, I know people are concerned about whether the dollar will appreciate by a lot as people.
That was my next question.
No, I just don't. That doesn't seem like a relevant argument. I can see the dollar strengthening for other reasons, but not because people are literally moving cash back, because that cash already is in the U.S. economy for all purposes. It's just not being used for investment, because that's, like I said, when it gets taxed. It's certainly attractive. I mean, the U.S. is stepping up its game in terms of competing for corporate investment. The corporate tax rate at 21% brings it kind of bang where the rest of the OECD is. And so that's a big deal. The whole shift to the territorial system is another big difference that they've made, where you only get taxed on income earned in the U.S. but not outside. So those are two big changes. And it should certainly have some effect on attracting investment back into the U.S. I don't think it's going to have a huge effect.
I have two questions from that on how 2018 will play out. Will the dollar get stronger?
I believe it will. That will be. It's one thing I tell my students all the time is don't try to predict where the dollar is going. So I'm making that mistake here. But given the fiscal spending, given the expansion in the fiscal deficit, an increase in the U.S. debt of $1.5 trillion, That, and with the U.S. growing, that should, in my opinion, be associated with a stronger dollar.
Okay. On the other hand, the argument advanced in India, one of the arguments is that with the U.S. cutting tax rates, Indian government should also be competitive and cut rates, corporate tax rates, that is.
Right.
Is that a legit argument?
I don't think I want to respond to competing to the U.S. I can see an argument for having, 25% corporate tax rates in India as kind of good policy. Mm-hmm. If they can manage at the same time to keep the deficits where they are and not grow debt, I can see an argument for that.
Okay. All right. Lower taxes, but not necessarily to compete with the U.S.,
No.
you think?
No.
Okay. All right. Finally, Gita, just a few more guesses about how things might pan out in India. What kind of a growth would you give for FY19?
It's 7% around.
Okay.
In that
straddling
ballpark.
that figure?
Yeah.
Okay. And inflation?
Inflation, I think, could go, the headline inflation could go up to between 4 and 5%.
Thank you very much, Gita Gopinath, for joining us. And I think a lot of our viewers are going to like the fact that Gita is not advising a rate hike just yet because growth still needs some help, and the RBI should have a little more tolerance to 4% plus or minus 2%. That plus 2 should be used. I'm sure that's music to the ears of a lot of you who are watching this interview. Thanks for watching.